Before looking at deglobalization and that phase and all that, we'll try and see what led to slowdown of the process of globalization. We discussed a few minutes earlier that from 2008 financial crisis, in 2008 we had a financial crisis that gripped the entire world, a crisis that actually had its genesis in North America but began to impact economies across the entire world. So the financial crisis of 2008 made the countries realize that it is because of the complex mutual interdependence that the countries have entered into because of the process of globalization, that their economies had become vulnerable to events or incidents that occurred across continents. Okay, somewhere in North America, if there was a crisis, it is beginning to affect the economy in some other country across continents. Now this country realizes its vulnerability, and therefore the countries began to have second thoughts about the process of globalization. It was from here onwards there was a critical turn of events when countries began to feel the process of globalization may actually not serve their national interests. That was the first instance. And also we had seen increased trade wars. Okay. And thirdly, a lot of middle classes in the developed economies, particularly in the developed economies, began to feel very frustrated because of loss of opportunities. Now please remember, in the developed countries, as their production base was being shifted to those countries which offered cheap labor, cheap raw material and good governmental incentives, facilities, tax holidays and so forth, as the capital and the production base began to shift to the other countries away from the developed countries, the middle classes in the developed countries began to feel the disadvantage of the process of globalization. Okay, primarily because they lose their opportunities, their employment opportunities. Okay, as production base is shifted to another country, obviously employment will be created in that country where investments are made, not in the developed country. So middle classes in developed countries began to feel disempowered. Okay. So from here onwards, a lot of concerns were being raised. A lot of concerns were being raised about the process of globalization. And these concerns have put pressure on the governments to slow down the process of globalization. Okay. Now globalization as a process initially was viewed with a lot of suspicion by the developing countries. Okay. Because developing countries' markets are vulnerable to the manipulations of the more powerful and rich countries, particularly the multinational corporations of the rich countries. Therefore, initially, the developing countries were feeling suspicious about the process of globalization. Okay, but from the financial crisis of 2008 onwards, with the increased shifting of production bases to the developing countries, the middle classes in the developed countries began to criticize the process of globalization. So there was a political pressure, okay, and there was concern about over-reliance on trade with single partners. Okay, so when you have trade with a single partner and that country is able to dominate the supply chain, you already stand to feel pressurized. Okay, that was the problem with the process of globalization, and that led to what was called as globalization. Further, COVID-19 also was almost an eye-opener. Okay, with international trade coming to a near standstill because of COVID-19, the countries realized that over-reliance and over-dependence on supply chains from other countries actually made their economies more and more vulnerable. Okay, so this is what's called as the supply chain vulnerability. A good number of countries, particularly developed countries, were dependent on supply chains from countries like China, Brazil, from countries like Vietnam, India. Okay, so once these supply chains were interrupted because of COVID-19, the developed countries began to feel the level of their vulnerability. Okay, it was from then onwards a little more caution went into the policies of the developed countries. Further, Russia's war with Ukraine, right, and the negotiations related to tackling climate change and over reliance on supply chains emanating from some countries were several other factors which made a good number of policymakers and strategic experts in various countries began to view globalization with a little more concern. Okay, so that was the trend that led to globalization from 2008 onwards. Okay, now graphically, we'll try and understand from roughly around 1870. Okay, when we can say that colonization almost became a full-fledged global reality from about 1870 till about 1915, let's say till the end of the First World War. Okay, we had globalization, and the globalization was sufficiently high. Okay, the process of integration was sufficiently high, particularly among the Western countries, the West European countries. Okay, as well as between the West European countries and their colonies. For example, India was a colony of England, right? So there was a strong supply chain between India and England. India supplied raw materials, England supplied finished products, and there was trade. Okay, so all this led to very high incidence of globalization. However, from 1915 to 1945, in the Western countries, West European countries particularly, there was this policy of protectionism. Okay, countries began to adopt what are called as protectionist measures. They wanted to protect their sectors, let it be the industrial sector or the agricultural sector, from the onslaughts of foreign imports. Okay, so protectionist measures became the order of the day. At the same time, it was during this time that we witnessed the two world wars. Okay, so the development of very dangerous ideologies like fascism, Nazism, which preached nationalism and imperialism, adoption of protectionist measures, tariff wars, trade wars, the Great Economic Depression of 1929, all these factors have actually brought down the process of globalization. From 1945 till about 1990, okay, that is almost till the end of the Cold War, there was globalization, of course, but that was also not very pronounced, primarily because of the Cold War and the breakup of the world into two power blocks. Okay, the Western bloc, the capitalist bloc, headed by US, the Eastern bloc, the socialist bloc, headed by Soviet Union. Because of this bipolar world and because of the breakup of the world into these two power blocks, this East-West divide hampered the process of globalization. Therefore, globalization also during this phase was not very pronounced. However, with rapprochement and accommodation between the two superpowers from, let's say, the late 1970s onwards, okay, till 1990, we had seen globalization increase. Okay, why? Communism became weak, capitalism began to advance rapidly across many parts of the world. A good number of countries adopted capitalist measures or capitalist policies, and a new ideology called neoliberalism began to gather momentum. Neoliberal ideology. Okay, neoliberal ideology preaches principles like liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So, globalization as a process can be understood at the backdrop of the popularity of a new ideology called neoliberal ideology. Okay, it was this ideology that powered the process of globalization, and from 1990 till about 2005, we had seen globalization reach its peak. Okay, and from 2005 to 2020, we had seen globalization, and more particularly from 2015 till 2025, there are a good number of strategic experts who claim that we are witnessing the phase of de-globalization. The phase of de-globalization. Countries, as a process, as a part of de-globalization, are trying to reduce dependence on global supply chains. I told you, right? Countries have begun to feel their vulnerability after COVID-19. Okay, and therefore the countries began to prioritize their domestic industries and strengthen the local supply chains and reducing dependence on global markets. Even in India also, in recent times we have spoken about Atmanirbhar Bharat. Okay, we had spoken about production linked incentive. We had spoken about raising and accelerating MSME program RAMP. We had seen China plus one strategy. All these are strategies adopted by India as well in trying to prioritize domestic industries, strengthen local supply chains, adopt what are called as import substitution policies or measures. Okay, a good number of countries, particularly in the Western countries, they're trying to reshore their production, okay, and restore their domestic supply chains. For example, Make America Great Again, MAGA. The MAGA agenda is primarily based on trying to bring back the investments. Donald Trump is speaking to the big tech giants in his company to bring back their investments. He's asking them, how much are you going to invest in America again? This is what's called as reshoring production. Economies prioritizing self-sufficiency. Okay, so countries are now trying to prioritize self-sufficiency so that the vulnerability created through their dependence can be reduced. So this is how, in recent times, countries are trying to, reduce their vulnerabilities. Secondly, we also have seen in recent times countries adopt more and more protectionist measures, mercantilist policies or mercantile measures, prioritizing their own interests. And for that, countries are ready to impose restrictions on trade. Mercantile policy is a policy of restrictive trade practice which gives a benefit to the home country. Okay, so you put some restrictions on trade so that it benefits your economy. Such type of policies are called as mercantile policies. Okay, so countries are adopting mercantile measures. Countries are imposing unilateral tariffs. Okay, for example, Donald Trump says, I'm going to impose 50% tariff on India because India is buying cheap oil from Russia. Unilateral tariffs are being imposed by countries, leading to frequent trade wars. Okay, so if America is going to impose tariffs, other countries going to respond with corresponding tariffs on America. Okay, so this is how we have seen trade wars, which actually is hampering the process of globalization. Countries begin to build walls rather than build bridges. Okay, next, we also have seen countries trying to exit from the policies which led to integration of economies. For example, we had witnessed the Brexit in Europe, where England exited or Britain exited from European Union. Okay, so the post-Brexit trade policies are policies which are primarily intended towards localization of production. Okay, removing all those supply chains to production as well. Okay, in US we had seen policies like the Inflation Reduction Act. In India, we had just discussed a few minutes earlier, production linked incentive, RAMP schemes. All these are primarily for the purpose of boosting domestic industries as well as for import substitution. We are trying to substitute our imports. So these are how countries are being more and more protectionist. Okay, so first is, as we discussed a little earlier, reducing supply chain dependency, and secondly, increased protectionism. Third, we also have seen in recent times the rise of nationalist, right-wing nationalism is what we had seen in recent times. Okay, and aggressive nationalism, right? Now, why this has happened is, as I told you, because of the perceived job losses in the developed countries, particularly the middle class, which are feeling disoriented or disillusioned because of the process of globalization. Why? Because they feel that the process of globalization had deprived them of their legitimate employment opportunity. Okay, so that's one reason as to why we had seen rise of nationalism. Also, we had seen weakening of global governance structures, disregard to such bodies. For example, the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, World Health Organization also. America had withdrawn from World Health Organization. America says that it's not going to refer its trade disputes to World Trade Organization. This is what's called as disregard to international structures of governance. Okay. Also, stricter immigration controls. For example, we had seen in recent times more strict H-1B policy is being adopted by America to discourage immigrants. Though America is very much in requirement of STEM professionals from India, science, technology, engineering and mathematics professionals, STEM professionals. America is dependent on Indian professionals, but still America has adopted very strict immigration policy. Okay. Apart from this, we also have geopolitical tensions, conflicts. We had the Arab-Israel conflict, the Gaza conflict, the Russia-Ukraine war. We had instability in South Asia, change of regimes in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. We had seen rise of transnational actors, particularly international terrorist organizations. All these have hampered the process of integration. That's the reason why we had witnessed in recent times a greater amount of de-globalization. For example, even Trump's policies, which are very populist for that matter, okay? Protectionism, strict immigration rules, withdrawal from global agreements, okay, like the Paris Climate Agreement. He had declared that America was going to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. The America First approach, right? All these have disrupted global supply chains. They have weakened multilateral institutions, okay? So from globalization, what we are witnessing today is countries adopting more and more protectionism, trade barriers, tariffs and trade wars, nationalist and populist agendas by government, conflicts which are an outcome of primacy of national interest. All this is what we had witnessed in recent times, which is casting a doubt on whether the process of globalization is smooth or not. There are a good number of experts who continue to believe that we have actively entered into a phase of de-globalization. This is for your perspective on the current process of globalization, which is a very important topic in international relations, both in political science and international relations as well as for General Studies Paper 2. With this, we come to an end of this video on globalization. Best wishes to all the aspirants for civil services from Srimeda IAS Academy. Thank you so much.